Hello guys, in this video I'm going to be converting this Benetton Ford B192 Formula 1 car into the Pacific PR01 F1 car from the 1994 Formula 1 season. I say convert, but that's a bit of an overstatement to be honest. The Pacific PR1, despite being developed 2 years after the B192, was basically the same car, it just wasn't developed. So a large part of this conversion will simply be using some alternative decals with a couple of minor modifications to the front wing. If I was intending to build the Benetton, I would definitely need some new decals however, because these kit ones, which are, well, 30 years old now, are clearly showing signs of age. You can see the texture in those there. So instead, as I say, we're going to be using these decals here from Studio 17. You can see we've got a couple of options here. The top version with those blue and pink sort of wave patterns on the side of the car, and then further down we've got the version with the Ursus vodka from Iceland. In reality, as was common with a lot of Grand Prix cars in those days, particularly the teams that were struggling for funding, there were quite a few different liveried versions of the Pacific during the season. The good news is that Studio 27 have included a lot of those decals on this sheet, so we should be able to make up any version we come across. So you can see here, for example, we've got the version which is the first version on the decals with the wavy marks on the side pod and the Pacific logo on the airbox. So that's an early season version. Then we have a later version which has the Ursus of Iceland logo on the side and nothing on the airbox. So that's a version that's not mentioned on the decals. Then we have a version with the Ursus logo on the side and the Pacific logo on the airbox. From what I've seen, this was used in at least the Canadian Grand Prix. What I haven't been able to find is the second version on the decal sheet, which is the GPS logo on the airbox and the extended Ursus logo on the side pod that extends beyond the side pod to the side of the cockpit. I couldn't find any reference photos of that. Anyway, the version I like is this one here from the Canadian Grand Prix with the Ursus logo and the Pacific logo on the airbox. And in case you're wondering why that logo sometimes appears in blue and sometimes appears in red, it is for the different drivers. So Bertrand Gachot here has the logo in blue, while Paul Belmondo has it in red. And Formula 1 nerd side note, the Pacific team had arranged a large sponsorship deal with a tobacco company called Black Death, but unfortunately after the events of the San Marino Grand Prix it obviously wasn't appropriate to have that logo and the Skull and Crossbones logo on their car, so they lost out on that sponsorship deal. In terms of results, the Pacific PR01 was not successful in any way, shape or form. Paul Belmondo only managed to qualify for 2 out of 16 races, and he retired from both of those. Bertrand Gachot only managed to qualify for 5 out of 16 races, and he retired from all 5 of those. So unsurprisingly, they had no drivers' points, no constructors' championship points, and they were last in the constructors' table. Having said that, I do quite like the look of this car, and I do also quite like the fact that it's going to be an unusual model. I quite like having unusual models on my shelf. There can't be that many people who have a Pacific PR1 in their Formula 1 collection. So while I was nattering there, I've started with the build. So I think the key for F1 kits, and probably for any car kit really, is to work on sub-assemblies and build up as bigger sub-assemblies as you can. For this particular project that's a bit easier because it's going to be a curbside project. I'm going to cover the engine up and I'm going to glue the engine cover down because the Benetton had the Ford engine and the Pacific had the Ilmor engine. Of course I do still need to build up the engine because the suspension hangs off the back of it, but at least I don't need to do all the painting and the detailing of it. Equally, because of that, I can put the side pod cooling and radiators in place. And I decided to take a slightly different approach to this build compared to my other F1 builds because I really didn't want to be trying to glue parts once they had lots of paint on them. I know you can scrape the paint off the gluing surfaces, but I still get nervous that if any glue leaks out and damages the paint or anything. So what I decided to do is basically glue all of the bodywork parts, all of the yellow-orange parts here, to each other and paint them as one. I placed them on the floor of the car to make sure everything was lined up and then glued them all together here. So we've got the engine cover in place and the front of those side pods. So it was clear from reference photos that the front wing of the Pacific car is different to the Benetton. One difference is these flaps here at the rear, which are shorter and have a curved edge on them. It also occurred to me that the front wing has the raised centre section, but it doesn't have this curve going from front to back like the Benetton does. So I would need to straighten out that leading edge there of the wing. I did that by cutting off the excess plastic and then sanding it until it was flush. The rear wing is much easier to deal with, partly because Tamiya give it to you as just one large piece with an insert, and partly because it's exactly the same as the Benettons. The end plates of the front wing are also radically different, as you can see here. So there was no way that I could shape the existing end plate into that new shape. So I took some styrene card, guesstimated the approximate size, and cut it out. I still need to curve the edge there, but I think that looks quite similar to the reference photo. There we go, there's our modified front wing. With that done, I can move into the painting process fairly quickly. I started by painting the seat matte black. This probably wasn't the best base for a red paint for the seat belts, but I made it work with a few layers. I used metallic grey on the brake discs. And then it was time to move on to the bodywork itself. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what colour this car is. If we look at the reference photos, it appears anywhere from sort of flat grey to gloss aluminium and a few shades in between. In the end, after giving everything a primer coat, I used Tamiya TS17 gloss aluminium. Looking at this here, my workmanship on the car body here is not great. The join lines, the panel lines as it were, are not super clear and crisp, and the paint itself is not fantastic. I did try to sand the paintwork back with a high grit sandpaper to make it a bit smoother, and then apply another coat of paint. But I think in reality I could have done a much better job at this. The front suspension section needs to be assembled before the nose cone and the nose panel can be put in place. Then the mounts with the brake discs and the cooling ducts for the brake discs clip onto the suspension arms. These are fairly standard in Tamiya F1 kits, and I wonder how simplified they are and how accurate they actually are. In preparation for the decals, I gave the whole car a coat of TS13, which is Tamiya gloss. Normally I've never had any problems with this, and of course it was over a Tamiya base coat. But perhaps I applied it too thick or something, because there was a certain yellow cast on areas of the car. You can see it here on the right hand side of the side pod, where it meets the airbox. It's just a sort of slightly yellow discoloration there, and the same thing on the nose as well. I was tempted to say stuff it, just go ahead, but in actual fact I went back, I sanded it down through that coat of gloss, back to the paint, reapplied a coat of paint, and then I glossed everything again, this time not with the TS13 but with VMS gloss varnish. And of course, because everything had been constructed at this point, that meant I had to go back and brush paint all of the black areas like the under tray and the suspension arms. Next up were the decals. Studio 27 give us two options for the car here. Although unusually for them, they don't tell us what races these are from. And as I mentioned earlier, there are various other permutations of these logos. One of the more common ones is we see the Ursus of Iceland vodka logo, but without the white background. And we see that in combination with the Pacific logo on the airbox and with no logo on the airbox. You'll also notice that the front wing end plates on these two diagrams are different to the reference photos I've shown you. And in fact they match the original B192 end plates. In the end I went with a reference photo, and it was the Canadian Grand Prix that included my favourite scheme, the Ursus logo and the Pacific logo. The only issue I have with this scheme is the decals don't include that dark blue Sistran logo which goes on the side of the car just underneath the driver. And they're also missing that dark green logo just in front of the rear wing, between the rear wheels. I'm not sure what logo that is, but it's not included. Nevertheless, the decals went down well. I started with the coloured stripes because they're probably the most important to get correct. The decals needed a long time in water, far longer than normal, but they did go down very smoothly with a small amount of Tamiya mark fit. I always like this stage because it turns a quite ugly looking car with just paintwork into a rather nice looking machine, I find. And you can see here what I mentioned earlier, just some rough edges around the bodywork and the floor there that I really should have taken more care to clean up. I did a much better job on my Williams FW07, which I made recently and which will be in a future video. The car I've gone for here is number 34, which is Bertrand Gachot, and I've gone for him because he had the blue Ursus logos, and I prefer those to the red of Paul Belmondo. Tamiya tyres are fairly standard amongst their F1 kits. They always have this seam line down the middle. I find the easiest way to remove it is to fit the wheel and then use some fairly low grit, maybe 400 grit sandpaper to remove it. It takes some effort, it makes a mess, but they can come out looking pretty decent. The Studio 27 decals also included the Goodyear Eagle tyre markings, and these are needed because they should be yellow, not white as came with the B192. Unlike the Tamiya decals, which are those sort of strange dry transfer decals, these ones are regular wet transfer decals. How long they'll stay on this rubber surface I don't know, but they seem to adhere fairly well for the purpose of taking the photos. And with that done, my model was complete. And there we have it, guys. That was my build of the Pacific PR01 F1 car from the 1994 F1 season, based on the Tamiya Benetton B192. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know that F1 cars are not the favourite subject of many of my viewers, but I do like to build a variety of things, and I am a big F1 fan. And on that note, there may not be a video next week because I'm going to be busy marshalling at the British Grand Prix from Thursday through to Sunday. But I will be back with another video soon. Before I go, let me say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. They've already seen this completed model on the respective pages a few days ago, as well as lots of work in progress photos for all my builds. So thank you to all of you guys for your ongoing support, it's massively appreciated. Thank you once again to everyone for watching, and until next time, have fun modelling.